Next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on getting it right for every child. Practice Development Panel's report. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions and interruptions. And I call on John Swinney. Cabinet Secretary, 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, there is wide agreement across this chamber that we want to get it right for every child, so they can grow up loved, safe, respected and able to reach their full potential. However, too often we have all heard cases where children and families have not had access to the support that they need. The Named Person Service was designed to help address that and make sure that every child in every part of Scotland would be able to get the support they need when they need it. That is a key characteristic of getting it right for every child, and I reaffirm the Government's commitment to that policy direction today. I believe everyone in this chamber shares our aim of promoting the well-being of Scotland's children, even if sometimes we disagree on how best to go about doing that. Naturally, parents are the biggest influence on a child's well-being as caregiver, role model, teacher and guide. Yet sometimes a child or their family may need some additional help. I've had the great privilege of meeting people across Scotland who are passionate about providing that help, and I've seen powerful examples of the difference they make to children's lives. I want to make sure that support is available to all who need it. Legislation to support the Named Person Service was intended to help do that. The aim has always been, as set out in the Policy Memorandum of the Information Sharing Bill, and I quote, to act as a clear point of contact for children, young people and their families and their parents to go to should they wish to seek support, information or advice. This function has never really been controversial. Where there has quite obviously been significant controversy is around when and how information should be shared by and with a named person. Legislating to support and safeguard something as individual as a child's well-being has its challenges, and we believe the Supreme Court judgment required us to make changes to legislation on information sharing. The result was the Children and Young People Information Sharing Bill. Since we introduced that bill in 2017, however, there have been significant changes to the data protection legal landscape, such as the introduction of GDPR and the new Data Protection Act 2018. And of course, the scrutiny of this Parliament through the Education and Skills Committee has resulted in the pausing of consideration of the bill. In order to chart a way through this complexity, I established a panel of experts to explore the development of a statutory code of practice for information sharing. And there was a critical point in relation to their work. I charged them with ensuring that the code was, to quote their remit, workable, comprehensive and user-friendly for children and young people, parents and practitioners. I asked the panel to produce a code that everyone, not just lawyers specialising in data protection, could understand and use. And I would like to thank Professor Ian Welsh, OBE, and the panel members for taking on this complex task. Today, I have published the panel's report. They have concluded that to achieve all the aims I set them in a single statutory code is simply not possible. In light of this, I have had to consider how best to proceed. Foremost in my mind has been how to ensure families can access the help they need, when they need it, in a way that respects their rights and gives them confidence that personal information is handled correctly. And in considering this, the panel's work has proven invaluable. They reviewed the data protection legislation that came into force during 2018 and concluded that the world has moved on significantly since the bill was drafted. Now that we have a new statutory framework, including through the introduction of GDPR, they conclude that we should not introduce a statutory code of practice. The panel concluded that we can rely on the law as it currently stands, founded on the Data Protection Act and GDPR. In practical terms, that means that we will not produce a binding legal code, and it means that information sharing will only take place in line with the law as it currently stands. Instead of the code, the panel recommends we provide practical help, guidance and support to enable professionals, practitioners, children and families to understand their rights under the existing law. We are today accepting the recommendations in full. This also reflects feedback from practitioners who have loudly and clearly called for clarity about how and when information can be shared. My officials will now work with stakeholders to develop a suite of products to support and promote good, proportionate and appropriate information sharing practice within existing law. It will include further training and guidance for practitioners, updated Getting It Right for Every Child guidance, and material to reassure the public on how the service operates. The panel report sets out the detail in full, but crucial will be the 4 recommendations on additional investment, an update of the Getting It Right for Every Child policy statement, measures to support transparency of information sharing, and a refreshed suite of practice guidance. From a parent's point of view, what this means is that information about a child or young person will not be routinely shared without their or their family's knowledge or engagement. And from a practitioner's perspective, it simply means this: anyone operating these services must handle personal information in line with existing laws and guidance, such as those applicable in relation to data protection, confidentiality and human rights. In taking this approach, I hope and believe we have resolved the information sharing controversy at the heart of named person, and that we have done so in a way that protects the vitally important policy of getting it right for every child. The law on information sharing will not now change. The way information is shared will be based on existing law, and we will provide help and support to make practitioners certain that they get it right and that families know what can and what cannot happen to their personal information. Consequently, I am advising Parliament today that I will be writing to the Presiding Officer to withdraw the Children and Young People Information Sharing Bill. This brings me to the Children and Young People Act 2014 and the Statutory Named Persons Scheme. Part 4 of the Act makes provision for every child and young person to have a named person. Part 5 introduced the requirement for a child's plan when a child's well-being required the support of a targeted intervention. These elements of the 2014 Act are awaiting the passage of the Children and Young People Information Sharing Bill before being brought into force. The reality, however, is that many community planning partnerships already operate elements of a named person service and child's plan. These services are provided within their existing statutory functions, under existing legislation, and have evolved over the last 10 years to provide early help, high-quality planning and coordination of services. I want this to be something more families can benefit from. Presiding Officer, I want to be absolutely clear. This service does not require well-being information about a child or young person to be routinely shared without their or their family's knowledge or engagement. As I said earlier, this aim of supporting families when and where they need it has largely been uncontroversial. Having addressed the information sharing controversy, we must now ensure the help and support the named person service currently provides to children and families continues. This service is already making a massive difference in children's lives. It should be recognised that in the last 5 years, since we introduced the 2014 Act, we have seen real advances in culture, systems and practice in services that support families, and this has improved lives the length and breadth of this country. We must continue to build on this progress to increase confidence in the delivery of the Getting It Right for Every Child approach, including the named person service. I am wholly supportive of existing good practice continuing. The Child's Plan is also being used across children's services and has been well received. Children and families are already benefiting from practitioners working closer together in a coordinated way to support children in all aspects of their well-being. Our commitment to these policies and the practitioners who implement them is reaffirmed today. They are in place, they are effective, and they change lives for the better without the need for underpinning legislation. I am therefore giving notice of our intention to seek to repeal Parts 4 and 5 of the Children and Young People Scotland Act 2014 using a suitable legislative vehicle in due course. I believe that today we have taken an important step forward in providing families and practitioners with certainty about how information sharing can support well-being in a transparent way which respects the rights of everyone. The mandatory named person scheme for every child, underpinned by law, will now not happen. We will withdraw our bill and repeal the relevant legislation. Instead, Existing voluntary schemes that provide a point of contact for support will continue under current legal powers where councils and health boards wish to provide them and parents wish to use them. In this way, we will support our children and young people so that they can thrive and rise to the challenges and opportunities that life brings. Only through continued investment in our children's well-being will we achieve our vision of a prosperous country where everyone gets the chance to fulfil their potential and no one is left behind. That is why we continue to be fully committed to getting it right for every child.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow 20 minutes for questions, after which we must move on to the next item of business. Can I ask members who wish to ask a question to press the request to speak buttons now? I call Liz Smith, be followed by Ian Gray. Ms Smith.
Thank you. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for prior sight of the statement? This Parliament knows only too well that I've held very strong views on the name person policy from the very beginning. And I do not believe that any tears will be shed this afternoon by parents, teachers, health and social care professionals, by campaigners and of course by the public who have persistently told the SNP that this was one of the most deeply unpopular, illiberal and unworkable policies of modern times. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he will now apologise to all those professionals on the front line who have had to endure endless bureaucracy and anxiety about where their legal responsibilities lay? Will he apologise to local authorities who've had to divert significant resources away from other spending priorities in order to retrain their officials and practitioners? And will he apologise to all the families across Scotland for the general upset that this policy has caused over the last 5 years?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's really important in this discussion that we remember that in all of this discussion, the government's intention, its policy intention at all times, has been to put in place measures that would support and enhance the well-being of children and young people in our society. And I will not apologise for trying to find the best way to try to do that. And in so doing, I have carried, and the government has carried, significant support and engagement from the self-same professionals and local authorities and families that Liz Smith talked about. Because what I hear from members of the public who come to see me and who have come to see me over the last 22 years as their Member of Parliament is frustration at the lack of connection between public services in meeting the needs of individual families, with cries for help when people needed them the most. So I will not apologise for trying to help those individuals. What I will do is put in place, as I do every day of the week, the measures to support the enhancement of the well-being of children and young people in our society, and that's what I'm determined to do in the future.
Ian Gray will be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, and my thanks also for prior sight of the statement. When the Cabinet Secretary dropped his education bill, I called it the mother of all ministerial climb-downs, but he has outdone himself today, losing 2 bills, 1 dropped and 1 repealed. This must be the mother and father of humiliating U-turns. The difference is that the education bill was a bad idea. Named person was a good idea, supported by this Parliament. It has been destroyed by the incompetence of a succession of ministers who lost control of the implementation, who lost the support and confidence of practitioners and public, who lost the legal challenge in the Supreme Court, and who lost the argument in the Education Committee. The Cabinet Secretary talks about the good intentions of the policy, but good intentions do not alone make for good government. And this has been very poor government indeed. Now, the Cabinet Secretary wouldn't apologise to Liz Smith, but we on these benches have tried to support this legislation, as have many professionals and organisations in the sector. So will the Cabinet Secretary at least apologise to them for the mess he's made of this?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the crucial point in responding to Ian Gray's contribution is this, that the legislation that I have tried to enforce and take forward was legislation that was supported in this Parliament by the SNP, the Labour Party, the Liberals, the Greens and the Conservatives in the final vote in the legislation abstained on that bill. So this is legislation which Parliament has supported comprehensively. And what I've tried to do when faced, because obviously this legislation was challenged in the courts in Scotland before I became the Education Secretary, and it succeeded in passing those challenges in the court. It was an issue of concern was raised by the Supreme Court in relation to the provisions on information sharing, and we have done our level best to try to protect the legislation that Parliament itself enacted. And that is the duty of government, to try to ensure that we do everything we can to implement the legislation that Parliament has passed and to make sure that can be done effectively. And I've sought every possible avenue to do that through the introduction of successor legislation and by inviting Professor Ian Welsh and his colleagues to look carefully at how this issue could be resolved. They have found it impossible to find a way that would provide a meaningful statutory code of practice which was, in our view, the means that would address the issues raised by the Supreme Court. I can't ignore the Supreme Court, and I've never at any time sought to do so. But in trying to address the Supreme Court's issues, we have found, and the panel have found it impossible to do that in a workable fashion. So we have made every effort to do it. I have acknowledged and faced the reality of that difficulty today, and what I'm committing the government to do today is to make sure that we put in place all of the support we possibly can do to support vulnerable children and young people in our society who need the help of public services in every respect.
Thank you. Now, I have no desire to stymie questions and answers in this, but I would like to get 11 members in. So if we can follow my mantra to have short questions and succinct answers, that's a very important question session. I do understand that. Claire Adamson, followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Deputy First Minister has outlined that the Scottish Government will repeal sections 4 and 5 of the Children and Young People Act 2014. Does he share my view that the impetus around named persons since the bill was introduced to Parliament has resulted in improvements across children's services?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
It has, and because I think we can see in some of the assessments of the support that's available for children and young people, particularly the recent Nuffield report on health and well-being of children within Scotland, which illustrated some significant improvements in the circumstances of children and young people in our country. Now, there will be other challenges that will come along their way. The challenges of poverty are acute in Claire Adamson's constituency in Motherwell and Wishaw as a consequence of the changes to benefit regimes that are taking their course. But what the government will do is remain relentlessly focused on supporting those vulnerable children and young people. The statement that I have set out today and the pathway that I've explained today will, I hope, assist in ensuring that is the case for children and young people across Scotland. Michelle
Ballantyne, followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you. This debacle for me was very personal. I was the head of a children's service and a member of my local authority's GERFEC implementation team. So for me today, this is not just about asking you to apologise, but more about asking you to recognise that actually we had to put in a lot of extra work to make this work on the ground. And we told you back then that we could make this work. We didn't need legislation. This was about professional judgment. So I want you to commit today and future to listening to those of us who are on the front line and recognising that it is bureaucracy that creates many of these gaps, where social workers and children's workers don't have time. Instead, they're filling in paperwork.
Thank you. Question? Cabinet Secretary.
I think that there's elements of Michelle Ballantyne's question that I can agree with, that I want to make sure that our professionals on the front line are able and are confident about taking the necessary steps to support the well-being of children and young people in our society. And that does not need to be drowned out by bureaucracy. It needs to be supported by good practice and by good communication and by good integration of services. And there's many in the professional community have contributed hugely to the development of the named person service, have developed much of the practice which I applaud today and which I want to make sure anyone observing the statement takes from this statement an encouragement to continue to do so and to enhance that practice, because I believe, as I answered Claire Adamson a moment ago, the named person practice that we're seeing in place is actually benefiting the lives of children and young people as a consequence. So I've set out a route today which empowers professionals to take that agenda forward, and I look forward to supporting them in their endeavours.
Rona Mackay, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's continued commitment to GIRFEC, which was described by the Nuffield Trust last year as leading the way in the UK. So can the Cabinet Secretary expand on how this policy direction will shape the revised national guidance for child protection in Scotland that was announced in the programme for government?
Cabinet Secretary.
This is the work that we're doing here will be about trying to support, as acknowledged in the Nuffield Trust report, the importance of early intervention and prevention to support children and young people. So the whole agenda is predicated on ensuring that active support is in place. It's one of the foundations of the expansion of early learning and childcare as well, to ensure that we have the earliest possible intervention to support children and young people. On the question of child protection, we have in place a very well ordered, very clearly defined child protection approach. It is there to make sure that children who are at risk of harm are properly supported and the issues resolved on their behalf. And the thinking that comes out of the early intervention work will very much be brought to the heart of the work that is taken forward on child protection in the, as a consequence of the programme for government.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When the Education Committee took evidence on it in the autumn of 2017, it became clear that the Information Sharing Bill ran the very real risk of either conflicting with data protection laws or being rendered meaningless by them. What was identified by the committee must have been identified by the government's advisers. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether the advice did contain those warnings and when he received it?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think that, in a sense, Mr Johnson's question gets to the nub of the difficulty that the panel has tried to resolve, because there is intense complexity around interweaving pieces of legislation. And the objective of the Information Sharing Bill was to try to chart a course through that. And that was what the government set out as the framework within which we were intending to operate. What became clear in the work of the panel was that weaving that together would not be able to be done in an accessible way to children and young people, their families, and to practitioners at the same time. And I accept that conclusion. That's what I'm here to accept today, which is why the government is not pursuing the Information Sharing Bill. Now, what we hoped was that the framework we established, as envisaged by the Information Sharing Bill, would create the architecture within which that could be undertaken. The panel have said to us that cannot be done. I accept that conclusion, and that's why the government is taking the steps we're taking today.
Ross Greer, followed by Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary's announcement today completely vindicates the position of the Education Committee in 2017 not to proceed with his unsound bill. The unquestionably legitimate policy of named person has been devastated by the bungling of this government. So what does the Deputy First Minister have to say to those who are already acting as named persons across the country who will face further uncertainty and anxiety as a result of today's announcement?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would hope that those professionals would take from my statement today the government's unreserved support for the work that they are undertaking, which they have been undertaking, which I don't accept from Mr Greer's comments has been in any way undermined by the issues that we have wrestled with, because they've been getting on with that, of supporting children and young people in our communities in addressing the issues and the difficulties that they face. So what I say to those professionals is first a word of thanks for their efforts and their contribution, and secondly a word of encouragement to continue to develop the excellent practice that they're taking forward.
Alec Cole-Hamilton, followed by Colton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has wasted years of time and goodwill of those people involved in the delivery of the policy in the children's sector, including myself. Cabinet Secretary knows he had the support of my party, but we kept telling him where the faults lay and still he did nothing. Can I ask him what cost in terms of legal bills and workforce hours has gone into this failed policy, and what confidence he can offer hard-working colleagues in both the voluntary and public sectors that their concerns will be better heeded in other areas of policy?
Cabinet Secretary.
There's a number of points in there. First of all, on cost, Mr Cole-Hamilton knows that the Government has faced legal costs in relation to the defence of this legislation at the in the outer and inner house of the Court of Session and also at the Supreme Court. I think it's a quite reasonable position for the Government to commission legal costs to protect legislation that has been agreed by this Parliament, supported by Mr Cole-Hamilton's colleagues. We have incurred relatively modest costs in the practice development panel, costs less than £10,000 in the work that they've done. They've spent a huge amount of time on this effort, but their time has been given voluntarily. Which brings me to the last point, which is that contrary to what Mr Cole-Hamilton says, practitioners, and many of them were involved in the practice development panel, have given of their time willingly because they are hugely supportive of the direction of travel of this policy and want it to succeed. And I encourage them to continue in those efforts, and I hope that my statement today has given them that confidence and that clarity for the period going forward.
Fulton McGregor, followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I refer members to my declaration of interest as a registered social worker. And I want to associate myself with the comments here of the Deputy First Minister. Practitioners in social work, Presiding Officer, and other services work tirelessly on a multi-agency basis and want, in fact, demand confidence from us in this chamber in what they're doing. And I welcome the Deputy First Minister's emphasis on this in his statement. Can he expand on how the Government, local authority partners and other stakeholders can work together to encourage even more joint up working across children's services, building on the progress that has been made in recent years and some of the very good practice out there?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think one of the principal areas is by designing approaches that relentlessly focus on the circumstances of individual children. And the more we can keep the child's interests and children's well-being at the heart of our interventions, the more we will encourage focused joint working between different public bodies. That has to be the sensible, rational, evidence-based approach that will enhance the life chances of children and young people in our society, and I would encourage professionals to follow that guidance.
Maurice Corrie, followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. My colleagues across this chamber have today already outlined what a very great waste of time and money this fiasco has been from start to finish. Will the Cabinet Secretary now give us firm assurance that every public body involved will have up-to-date information sharing guidance in place by the end of this year? And if not, how long does he expect it will take?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, all public bodies, the clearest signal I'm giving to public bodies today is that public bodies need to operate within the current legislative framework in this country, particularly in relation to issues around data protection, around issues in connection to human rights. That is the law, and all public bodies today should be operating in that fashion. And so that's not anything new that's been announced today. That is the law of the land as it is today, and public bodies should be operating in that fashion.
John Mason, followed by Mary Fee.
Thank you. I have been a strong believer in the named persons system as a good scheme for helping vulnerable families in my constituency who are seeking help and would not be passed from pillar to post. Can he give any reassurance to these vulnerable families in my constituency that they will be able to find help when they go to the public sector?
Cabinet Secretary.
That is the import of my statement today, that I want to make sure that those who need assistance in our society are able to get it. I think the sentiment that John Mason has expressed there of encountering families who feel passed from pillar to post is an experience I've had all too often in my parliamentary life. I want to address that. I give him the assurance that that's the focus of this policy and the focus of the guidance and advice that we will provide as a consequence of this. And I'm confident that local authority partners, health boards and other bodies are similarly focused in taking forward the agenda in that fashion.
Mary Fee, followed by David Torrance.
Recommendation 4 of the GIRFEC Practice and Development Panel report states that there should be additional multi-year investment in multi-agency training. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell the Chamber how much that investment will be and when it will be in place?
Cabinet Secretary.
These issues will be part of the implementation approach the Government takes to addressing this issue. We'll discuss that with our local authority partners, as we do with and our health board partners in the normal course of our activities to ensure that we have in place the proper support that will enable the recommendations of the panel, which I accept in full, are taken forward and implemented.
And David Torrance.
I appreciate that the Cabinet Secretary has set out that we will not proceed with the Children and Young People Information Sharing Bill, but can he outline how the role of consent will factor in information sharing following this?
Cabinet Secretary.
The public practitioners have got to be take a careful approach to the handling of the issue of consent, because consent lies at the heart of these issues, but there is also the question of how practitioners evaluate whether that consent is being essentially given voluntarily by members of the public, where members of the public may feel obliged to give consent. So practitioners have got to exercise great care in how they approach the question of consent. Good family engagement, good dialogue is central to this whole question, to make sure that those who need services are able to get access to services, and practitioners can make the appropriate judgments in that context.
Thank you. That concludes questions in the statement. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and members, as everyone got their question in, as should be normal. A short pause as we move on to the next item of business.